June 25, 1876. A war chief stands over the bodies of his wives and children killed minutes earlier in the opening chaos of a cavalry attack. The smoke hasn't cleared. The battle is still raging around him, and in that moment, something shifts in him. Not just emotionally, but tactically. A man already known as one of the most dangerous warriors on the northern plains becomes something harder to define. Something the soldiers on that ridge above the Little Bighorn were completely unprepared for. His name was Gall, and what happened next, through his eyes, reads nothing like the story most Americans grew up hearing. We tend to think of Little Bighorn as a story about Custer, his daring, his miscalculation, his final charge, but Custer was dead within the hour. Gall lived for another 18 years, and he eventually sat down with American journalists and explained, in as much detail as the language barrier allowed, exactly what he saw, what he did, and what the battle actually cost. His account is not simple. It shifted across retellings, and historians still debate which version to trust. But even in its inconsistencies, it offers something the official record never could: the view from the other side of the field. This is that story. To understand why Gall's account carries the weight it does, you have to understand who he was before June 25, 1876. By his mid-30s, Gall was already one of the most respected war leaders among the Hunkpapa Sioux. That reputation wasn't ceremonial. It was earned through years of conflict, strategy, and an almost instinctive ability to read a battlefield. Sitting Bull, who was himself regarded as a spiritual and political leader of enormous authority, had formally adopted Gall as a brother. That wasn't a casual gesture. Among the Lakota, that kind of bond carried real weight. It's easy to overlook when reading about this period just how much pressure the Lakota and their Cheyenne allies were under by 1876. The government had promised land in the Treaty of Fort Laramie just 8 years earlier, only for that promise to dissolve when gold was discovered in the Black Hills. Prospectors poured in, the military followed, and the native nations who had been guaranteed those lands were now being told to relocate to reservations or be considered hostile. The camp at the Little Bighorn wasn't a war party. It was a gathering of families, thousands of people, who had chosen not to submit. Gall was among those protecting them. In the days leading up to June 25th, Sioux scouts had picked up signs of approaching soldiers, abandoned supply boxes, dust on the horizon, the kind of detail that, on the plains, meant you had hours at most to prepare. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, commanding the 7th Cavalry, had his own problem. His scouts had spotted movement near the village. His cover was compromised. In his calculation, hesitation meant the village would scatter before he could strike. So he made a decision that military historians have scrutinized ever since. He divided his command. Look at it this way. Custer was working from a fundamentally flawed intelligence picture. He believed the village was smaller than it was. Some estimates put the number of warriors in that camp at somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000. Custer's entire force numbered around 650, and he split even that, 3 columns, 3 directions. Major Reno from the south, Captain Benteen to the west. Custer himself swept north to descend on the village from above. It was a maneuver designed for a much smaller, less organized opponent. What he actually rode into was something else entirely. The battle didn't begin with Custer. It began with Reno's charge into the southern end of the village, a charge that hit directly where Gall's own lodges stood. Gall later described the confusion vividly: soldiers crashing through, bullets tearing through hides and canvas, women and children running. And then, the detail that arguably changed the course of the entire engagement, Gall found his wives and children among the dead. He was direct about what it did to him. His heart was bad, he said. Among the Lakota, that phrase carried a specific and serious meaning. It wasn't just grief. It was a state of fury that removed hesitation, removed calculation, removed mercy. From that moment, Gall later said, he fought with a hatchet. He stopped relying on a rifle altogether. This is worth pausing on. Here is a man who was already one of the most capable combat leaders on that field, and in the span of a few minutes, he lost his family and channeled that loss directly into the battle. Whatever discipline and strategy he might have otherwise applied, he was now operating with an additional dimension of ferocity that his opponents couldn't anticipate. Reno's attack, which was supposed to be a decisive strike, quickly turned. Warriors poured out of the timber surrounding his position. Outnumbered and outflanked, Reno's men began to break. A collapse made worse when a bullet struck Bloody Knife, a scout riding near Reno, killing him instantly in a way that visibly shattered Reno's composure. His command disintegrated. What had been a cavalry charge became a chaotic retreat across the river. Here is where the mythology gets most interesting and most contested. The popular image of Custer's last stand is one of defiant heroism. A commander going down fighting, surrounded by his men on a hill, facing an overwhelming force. That image took hold in American culture almost immediately after the battle and has never fully let go. Gall's account complicates it significantly. He described seeing Custer's column moving cautiously along the ridges above the village, pausing, appearing to study the terrain below. One officer, Gall said, rode forward and observed the village through field glasses. It was only later, after the battle, that Gall came to believe that officer was Custer himself. And in Gall's telling, it was the Lakota warriors who struck first. Custer didn't charge down into the village. He was caught before he could organize an attack. If that account is accurate, and not all eyewitnesses agreed, some described Custer advancing before being repelled, then the famous last stand wasn't an assault. It was a defense, a desperate one. What everyone agreed on was what followed. The soldiers' Springfield carbines began jamming under the heat of rapid fire. Warriors came from every direction, some armed with rifles, some with hatchets and clubs. The terrain itself was used as a weapon. Stampeding horses were driven through cavalry lines, scattering men and cutting off escape routes. It was over in less than an hour. The battle didn't end with Custer. Reno's surviving men had scrambled to a hilltop position. Benteen arrived with reinforcements, bringing their combined force to over 400, but they were dug in and desperate. No water. Wounded men in the open, heat pressing down. Gall and Crazy Horse chose not to waste lives in a direct assault. They encircled the position and waited. Thirst and time were their weapons. A handful of soldiers made heroic suicidal runs for the river to retrieve water for the wounded. Several earned the Medal of Honor for it. That detail alone, men risking death for a bucket of water, tells you everything about how dire the situation had become. It was only the arrival of General Terry's relief columns the following day that ended the siege. Sioux scouts spotted the dust rising on the horizon. The signal went out. The great camp broke apart and slipped westward into the mountains. The Battle of the Greasy Grass, as the Lakota called it, was over. For the United States, Little Bighorn was a national shock. Custer had been a celebrated figure, and the destruction of his command hit the country like few military defeats ever had. The response was swift and overwhelming. Within months, the Army had intensified its campaign against the Lakota. Villages burned, horses and food stores were destroyed. By the end of 1876, most of the Sioux had surrendered or fled north into Canada, where Gall followed Sitting Bull. But even in exile, the two men eventually parted ways, a fracture that historians attribute to different philosophies about how, or whether, accommodation with the United States was possible. Gall returned to the United States and settled at Standing Rock Reservation. He converted to Christianity. He cooperated with American officials. He became, in some ways, a bridge figure. To some of his own people, this was seen as abandonment. To others, it was simply a man navigating an impossible situation with whatever tools he had left. In 1886, a decade after the battle, Gall returned to the Little Bighorn as a guest at a commemorative ceremony. He spoke. Americans listened. For many, it was the first time they had heard the battle described by someone who had actually been there, fighting on the other side. Here is where historians have genuinely struggled, and it's worth being honest about that. Gall's account changed, not in its broad strokes, but in its details. Different newspapers published different versions. In some accounts, he described fighting Reno. In others, Custer. In at least one version, the death of his family. The event that, by his own account, transformed him during the battle, was absent entirely. Was Gall adjusting his story depending on his audience? Were interpreters mistranslating? Were reporters embellishing or simply mishearing a man speaking across a significant language barrier? The honest answer is that we don't fully know. But here's what's also true. The inconsistencies in Gall's testimony aren't necessarily evidence that he was being deceptive. Trauma reshapes memory. Public storytelling has always involved simplification and emphasis. And a man who had experienced what Gall experienced, the loss of his family, years of warfare, exile, the collapse of his nation's way of life, was carrying a weight that would affect how any story emerged from him, in any setting. What Gall gave Americans was something history had not previously offered, a first-person native account of a battle that had been mythologized almost entirely without native voices. Whatever its inconsistencies, that testimony cracked open a version of events that the dominant culture had been content to leave sealed. The Battle of Little Bighorn is one of those events where the facts themselves have always been somewhat contested. Archaeology, oral histories, military records. They each tell a slightly different story, and they don't always line up. What Gall's account does, more than anything, is force a question that serious historians have been grappling with ever since. When we construct a historical narrative, when we decide which version of events becomes the one taught in schools and commemorated in monuments, whose experiences are we centering? And what do we lose when those choices are made without the full picture? Gall died in 1894. He never stopped being a complicated figure, a warrior, a father, a survivor, a man who made accommodations that others found difficult to forgive. But he told his story, imperfectly, in fragments across different audiences and different years. And it's still worth listening to.